Hello and welcome to the tutorial regarding how to assign weights to your three-dimensional character for posing and animation using the component editor, also called using a spreadsheet technique. Now we've already covered the idea of painting your weights, and while that is much more accessible visually because you're looking at different color values, there's a way to determine exact percentages of influence to the character that you're weighting per vertex. And this is actually, to me, a preferred method because when your character is done, you have absolute perfect agency over everything that is assigned to a bone. So let me just briefly go over the idea here. First of all, this is a plane, and I've detached the skin so you can see kind of the process that I'm going to be going through to simulate the basic setup for a rig. And under bind skin, again, the method I'd like to use is joint hierarchy, interactive, and I like to use just 3 influences in this case. And I don't like multiple bind poses. Okay, so now what we have is we have a bound mesh. I'm going to turn on the wireframe on shaded here so you can kind of tell what it is I'm looking at. So this is pretty much a very simple way to see the deformations of your animated skeleton. But the reason I'm using a very simple mesh is because obviously there's no line going across here, and the rotation is happening at a plane where there's no line going in that direction, and that is really kind of a problem with modeling. So the first thing I want to talk about is that there's something in modeling called edge flow. So whenever you have a character, really what you should be thinking about your character being similar to in several different aspects is a cylinder. A arm is a cylinder, a leg is a cylinder, and even a torso, and to some extent the head, although the head has its own needs. When you get into basic body shape, you want to be able to look at a cylinder and say, I can see the leg, the arm, etc., because this is how all the different parts of a body should be. Not so much necessarily the shape, but something called the edge flow. When I talk about edge flow, I mean that you actually have a polygon line running the length horizontally and vertically of the mass. And in this case, we can not just click it, but I can double click, and you can see that that edge runs really the length all the way from the top all the way down the length of the shaft of this cylinder. And of course, it has kind of a cross cut going horizontally across the width. So you have length and width. Now, how does that really apply to character models? Well, take a look here. In this kind of basic male model, you have exactly that. This cut, this poly edge, is running the length of the chest, down the torso, through the stomach, all the way into the leg. And it goes all the way down the leg, and it goes and basically traces over the top of the foot. So each and every one of these poly lines, these edge loops, as it's called in modeling, is something you can trace all the way through the body. And what's very important is that you see the cylinder shape here in the stomach, in the torso, not just the stomach, which is the lower part, but the chest. The whole of the torso is kind of a modified cylinder, as is certainly the leg and the arm. And the head is truncated for this reason, but you know that a neck would be similar. When you come over here to kind of the armpit, this is a problem area for a lot of character modeling, because what you have is you have the torso, one cylinder, going up and then suddenly sprouting off into 2 different cylinders, and you don't want it to simply be stuck in the side like a tree. You want to have some accommodations here for the shoulder, because really the arm bends in one direction. You want to have the armpit carved out, and you want to have the top of the shoulder blade indicated so that it has width once this bends down to the side. Similar thing here with what we call a bikini cut here in the hips. A lot of people make the mistakes of just kind of sticking the legs straight across on hips that are perfectly horizontal and they're poly edge loops. And it doesn't work, because if you look at kind of Ken and Barbie dolls or these action dolls, you've got this kind of cut where the legs actually go up the hip. And that accommodates much more that whole section of skin that moves when you move your leg. Let's take a look here in a sort of modified female. Not as elegant put in for modeling, but it does the job. You've got poly lines that run from the head all the way down the neck, the back, into the back of the leg, and all the way to the floor. And you've got the same sort of bikini cut for the hip, allowing that leg to move at more of an angle. It's not straight across. You do not want to rig it so that this is the beginning of your leg movement. That's just going to look unrealistic. And again, up here, although the reason I'm not that in love with the way this model has been done is you get this kind of 5-starred section where all the polys meet in the middle, and that really can mean fragmenting and fracturing. You want to have, at best, kind of triangle where 2 points come into one line. But even when you were dealing with, say, animals, here's one of a wolf, and look how the lines from the head go into the nape of the neck, across the neck, shoulder blade, down, into the torso, all the way down into the leg, and then continue on down. And this is crucial because this is how the deformation is going to be affecting the whole body. You don't want sudden sections that hit a T, meaning the poly edge runs into a line and just stops. Because think of this all as a series of cylinders. You want your deformations to be as smooth as possible. And unless your model is modeled in such a way where the edge flow or the poly loops can accommodate it, it's not going to look smooth. In fact, there's a little error right here. The modeler should have taken that line and continued over here to where the rib cage is. And of course, modeled in the armpit and any recesses in the hip that you're going to be showing when the character is in a full sprint. Same thing with heavier characters. Here's a bear. And you've got from his muzzle up through the face, the neck, up over this shoulder carriage into the torso, and then back down into this into the back and into the back of the leg. I mean, it doesn't really stop. And I see people getting models that are not going to work because the poly edges just kind of go straight across and kind of end here in this star pattern in the back of the character. And it's not built to deform as a series of cylinders that are all welded together. Even if you're dealing with lower poly characters, like these sort of cute chibi characters, look how the top of the head, these lines that kind of bifurcate the face, go all the way down into the body. Yes, they're probably different models that were built at different times, but each one has a consistency of not just the vertical line, but the horizontal lines that help delineate the character. Everything is across and down. There's no like weird polys where they just tried to make it look like the character. There was a care here about deformation, even on this tiny chibi level. Here's a good demonstration. Here's a very stylized low poly character, but look at the way these phalanges of the armor are kind of inside of each other. The lines all sort of follow the direction of the shoulder, and these lines, you can go from the chest into the shoulder. Yes, they're separate pieces, but look, they're still accommodating that slight bend from the chest into the arm. The lines then go down into this arm and then into these huge gauntlets. So I see people that just model the model, and it's not built to deform. Those are two different things. Building it so it looks like a gauntlet, and building the gauntlet with these poly edge loops that allow you to deform it because it's a series of smaller cylinders is really what's going to help your character deform correctly. Even the tiny little feet here and the tiny little bones, they all kind of go from this kilt down into the knees and then into this boot, and there we are. So really nicely done all the way around, and that's really what we have when we rig something as complex as a finger. You've got one bone, you've got second bone and third bone, and only these poly loops are going to be affected by this bone. But this bone is going to slowly give way to this bone's influence here at about the halfway point. And then, of course, this yellow bone affects the middle of the finger, and this blue bone affects the last part, the lowest part, the first part of the finger. But really, it's about these concentric rings, these parallel rings. And we're going to be grabbing these rings because, again, the cylinder idea allows us to come in and dictate how the bones are affecting the object. And I'm going to show you how easy it is to set that up. So the first thing we want to do is come in and take a look at this cylinder from the side, and we'll draw under rigging, get some points going on. 1, 2, 3. Make sure they are at an adequate distance. We'll bring your bone setup into the middle of the cylinder, so this makes more sense. I'm just gauging it from the top here. Okay, so we have those two things selected, and I'm going to do a bind skin similar to what we had last time. Also, I'm going to come up here and make sure that you've got x-ray joints because it helps visibility. And when I rotate this, you're going to see that just like a finger or leg or torso, you get that kind of, smashed straw look. This, because it bends, it's sort of compromising this middle bit. And also notice that Maya, these two bones, Maya is giving some of the percentage of the influence to the previous bone, and you may not want that. So let's come over here and bring up the joint size so things are a little more obvious. There we go. And this is kind of what has happened with my initial offering of this rigged plane. You can see that there's no poly loops going across, and that's just never going to look as good as if there's a cut across here and things are following in kind of horizontal and vertical edge loops that follow the flow of the character. So make sure your model's done correctly. We luckily have a few that I'm offering to people, and but people that bring in their own models, you really got to be careful that the model that you have was built in a way that's going to allow good deformation, because sometimes that's not the case. So let's get back to the point about how we are familiar with now the paint weights skin tool. We can come up here to joints 4, 5, and 6 and just kind of start painting them in. We've done that. You can get a nice big brush and start painting away, and as we do that, it puts the influences on the other bones, aside from looking like a complete mess. But we know what's going on. I'm basically taking the wrong bone and giving it all the influence. If we want this to be flooded, we can just grab, we can either paint it, or we can use the other trick, which is to come in here and just grab the vertices, make sure that you can do one of two things. You can either click this icon up here, and it will make sure that when you're in vertex selection mode, all you are is going to grab vertices, and then from there, right click, paint skin weights tool, and then you can just flood. And that's gonna, that's something we've gone over in a previous tutorial. But what if we wanted to be a little more exacting? Well, let's get exacting. So under the selection of vertices, I want you to go up to Windows and come down to General Editors and Component Editor. All right. So under Windows, General Editors, Component Editor. Component Editor allows you to, every time you have a smooth skin, like so, click on that tab. All of these vertices here are now reflected in this spreadsheet. That ring of vertices that I've selected are reflected here, and they're given a little percentage to joint 4, 5, and 6. In fact, let's make this a little more friendly for the purpose of the tutorial. You can come in here, and I will open this up. Instead of 4, 5, and 6, I'm going to call it shoulder joint, and I'm going to go to the one below it. Well, elbow joint I think would be better. Elbow joint, and then the last one is called wrist joint. So, wow, I can't spell today. Amazing. Wrist joint. So when we come in here and we've got these vertices selected, there you go, nicer mode. You come up to Windows, General Editors, and Component Editor. Here we are with the spreadsheet again, and now the joints are a little more friendly. And we look at these and we say, well, this is kind of the very end. We want to put 100% of this onto the wrist joint. Well, what you can do is just kind of run down that whole list and with your left mouse button clicked, and just hold it down. And at the very end, when you release, you should have this area that's asking for a number. The cool part is when you type in 1 or any number, it basically then gives the wrist joint or whatever joint you've selected the value of 1, i.e. 100% influence on that bone. So if you were to come in here to Paint Skin Weights tool, it should have perfect white. So this is kind of doing the very same thing as painting weights, only you're using numbers instead of color values. For some that works better. And again, it's a way to really dictate that you are on top of each one of these successive parallel rings that is the character's body, because once you're done, you're sure that everything's taken care of. There aren't any weird leftover vertices that are floating around. So for instance, when you rig, take a look at some of these values. And I've grabbed a couple here. I'm going to grab just this ring if I'm careful about it. All right. Look at the values. The problem is that Maya, as you know, makes decisions like a logical computer, and so it's going to dictate its influence of vertexes according to the proximity of two different bones. But these values just are kind of all over the map, even as a consistent values of half, 0.555, 0.282. It's very messy. The problem is that when you start dictating things and you say, okay, I'm going to clean this up, I'm going to make this all 0.5, you still have two other bones that are getting the runoff. So while you're mathematically telling this elbow joint it only gets 0.5, you're taking all the rest of those values and just kind of giving them to Maya, and Maya will disseminate those as best it feels to these other two bones. But that doesn't necessarily mean it makes sense. Watch the value in elbow joint. When I press return, it's going to be 0.5, but also watch the value in shoulder joint and wrist joint. So we've cleaned up 0.5 for elbow joint, but now shoulder joint has 0.3 and then all these little unnecessary decimals afterwards. So you come in here and say, all right, look, I want to clean this out. I'm going to make this 0.3 and 0.2. Great. 0.3. And then it squeezes the leftover values back on the remaining two bones. So like slippery soap, it's kind of all over the map. And the only way you can lock this down is to literally lock it down. In other words, you've got a hold up here under each of the under each of the joints, and it by default is off, but you can turn it on. What does that mean? It means when you dictate the number that you want this to freeze to, it's not going to squeeze it over into any other joint unless it has the values, the hold is off. So what's going to happen here, if I type in 3, it's going to stay 3 here. This will stay 5. I've locked it off. So all the extra values are going to go here, so it's going to be 0.2, 0.2, 0.2. And that's exactly what happened. So this is a way to dictate and to make sure that you know what's going on. Is it sort of, is it crawling along fingers and bodies and things like that? And is it time consuming? Sure. But it's also lets you have absolute control over each one of these vertexes. And when you're dealing with low poly game characters, that's a good feeling. Some shortcuts you can use, by the way, go in and double click an edge. And if it is a nice ring, it should select the entirety of that ring. You may have to go around and kind of, pick each edge yourself by hand using shift, but that really shouldn't be too hard to do. Afterwards, you can come up here under modify and you can go, under select, and you can go down to convert selection to vertices. But notice that also it has a hotkey, Control 9. Keep that in mind. So your edges suddenly turn into control vertexes, and you've got them all right here in the component editor. And when you hold on when you have on selected for certain joints, then you can come in here and dictate that this one is also, let's say, for the elbow joint, it's going to be 0.3. Since the hold is off on wrist joint, this is the only place that all the leftover decimals go to. So if I go in here to shoulder joint and I type in 0.2, wrist joint gets 5. And that's just sort of controlling where all the extra vertices go to. You can take these on and off, and although you can't use these together in my opinion, very accurately, this has the same thing. You see this little lock icon on the far left of elbow joint? That's basically what you're doing over here in the component editor, only you're doing it when you've selected vertices. Now you do have something here in the paint skin weights tool that allows you to select things by painting on them, which is interesting. So you can paint here, and you're actually selecting vertices by painting them, and they show up here in the component editor. So you could actually start painting over sections of this character, and then instead of going into the paint skin weights tool, using the component editor instead. But it's a nice way to dictate, especially if you simply look at the poly loops that are between one side of the bone and the next, and you can say, well, basically this, if I'm to correct this, you can count the rings and say, well, even in orthographic mode, this is easier. You can say, well, I count that I've got between this bone here, just this elbow, and then this would be the wrist. I have 1, 2 poly loops. So this is sort of 0, this is 100 up here. If I divide that in 2, then I've got what, 33 and then 0.66. So I could take these values and grab the edge and then Control F9 to change them into vertices, and from there go up to the general editors, component editor, and here we are. And I can assign those values as I see fit. So elbow joint gets, or rather the shoulder joint, let's say it just gets 0. I don't want that to have any value. And the wrist joint is going to get 0.66, and this value is, in fact, the hold is going to be on now that I've dictated that. And off, I'm going to make it go to, you can actually use this slider to bring everything up and down in an absolute manner. Okay. So, and everything's got to equal 1 at the very end, so be careful of that. 67, look what happens, kind of shoots out to the shoulder joint. So if I want to, if you have any values that are sort of shooting around in space, then Maya will assign them somewhere, and chances are it will not put it onto the bone of your choice. I mean, look at this value, 0.010. That's kind of absurd. So the wrist joint, let's say 67, we're good there. The elbow joint is 0.33, and there we go. So we've got 33 and 67, and down here, grab the edge, Control F9, and you can just kind of crawl up and down the ringlets that are your characters and dictate what it is you want them to have as far as values. Wrist joints, I'm going to make the elbow joint actually have a value of, take the lock off, we've only got 2 bones here, and elbow joint is going to be 0.366, and this automatically becomes 3.4. Let's see how this applies to the goblin. Nice edge loops here. I want to point a couple of them out. This character here not only has a nice edge loop running down the length of the arm, into the forearm, all the way into the wrist, down into the fingers, but they've put a little cut here to kind of outline where the deltoid would be. And that would be this little hump right here. So the person that modeled this not only knew edge flow, but knew a little bit of anatomy. In fact, we don't really need to see the bones right now. So this ringlet runs all the way around his armpit, but you can see the cut of his tunic actually goes into the skin. So things are perfectly aligned. In fact, look at the lines going from the his little tunic down to the belly, and then kind of right into the belt, but then they are part of the belt. They come right out at that point into the belt, go down, they cut in again, and then become part of the tunic. So that really gives good edge flow. Not able to do it with this bandolero kind of belt here, but that's okay because it's in an area that's not going to really deform much. And this edge loop of this arm, same thing, all the way through the little heavy metal gauntlet. You can see where those lines kind of match up, and then out again into the wrist. Not perfectly aligned. I would have done a slightly better job to make sure that this thing all moves together, but there you go. This area here that goes from the tunic up into the neck you can follow it right into the head. I mean, this stuff is really nicely done so that it's going to deform well. Also, this edge into the knee goes down. If you look down in there, it actually goes into kind of this flower pot of the phalange of the boot. In fact, let's get a little closer. Really is nicely modeled. And so many people miss this. They build the character so it looks like a character, but when they rig it, it doesn't deform like one because these edge loops are missing. So if your edge loops are done correctly, the character should deform, because what I've pointed out is that even someone as sort of short and squat as this character with these kind of silly ballooned proportions obey the rules of edge loops so that they can deform later. And while not immediately discernible, it is going to make all the difference later when these legs are bending and moving. Look, the boot here goes out and then it cuts right in, and you can probably follow that whole edge all the way down the body, which is really, again, really well modeled. In fact, if I'm going to double click this edge, yeah, look at that, it kind of runs all the way up the body. Now things split off when it doesn't know exactly what edge to continue with if things split off, but you can shift and then add and then continue until you have pretty much the edge loop you want. And now it goes up all the way into the delt. I mean, really nicely done. And a majority of times when I'm dealing with models, they're not built to deform, and a rig cannot save it. So make sure that you know that before you begin weighting with these, because what you're going to be doing is pretty much coming in here and grabbing the ring on an arm and dictating how much you want it to go to the elbow, how much you want it to go to the wrist. But remember, once you do it, once you have defined the exact values that you want, then they are done. So when the character gets rigged up, you can have this really nicely done and expertly done, laid out character that deforms according to this spreadsheet method. And it's a very clean way of working. And you can take things that are these objects here. I'm going to crawl along it using that little trick where you grab a vertex and then just continually press greater than, which is shift period, and crawl all the way over this object because it looks like it was modeled separately, which it was. And then you can quickly come into Windows, General Editors, Component Editor, and if it is, you can define everything in the value of 1 to 1 bone, and the thing moves as one object. Really nice way to not sit there and have to paint everything or grab all the vertices and flooding it is kind of another way of doing this. But this is really when you're at the next level for a character, is that you take care of every little bit of this rigging, and it makes perfect sense. So let me know if you have any troubles doing this. Otherwise, happy waiting. It's another way of doing things, and it can work depending on your preferences. Alongside paint skin weights, in replacing paint skin weights, you can paint the skin weights first and then use the component editor to round things out. But it gives you several different ways of getting your character sorted out just fine. If you have any questions, let me know.